thank you so much for tuning in to today's CLIR 5 for 5 conversation, Collections in the Era of the Climate Crisis. My name is Casey Davis Kaufman, Associate Director of the GBH Archives and Project Manager for the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. For the past 6 years, since reading the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, Fifth Assessment Report, and subsequent reports and literature from scientists, journalists, activists, and others living close to the land and who are on the front lines, I have been increasingly alarmed by the climate crisis and the impacts we are already seeing on humanity and our natural world, as well as those we have yet to see. Communities from the Gulf Coast to the West Coast and the Alaskan Arctic regions are already experiencing devastating impacts of extreme weather events and heat exacerbated by climate change. Communities that have been historically marginalized and are among the poorest and most vulnerable are already seeing the greatest impacts. As archivists, those responsible for the preservation of humanity's record for current and future generations, a growing number of people in our community are recognizing the ethical responsibilities of our profession to respond to this crisis. I see our responses being fourfold. These responsibilities include protecting collections from disasters and other impacts of climate change, addressing the unsustainability of our current practices and developing new best practices for sustainable preservation and access, elevating and exposing historical and contemporary collections to support scientific research and public understanding of the human impacts on our environment. And as Dr. Anthony Lizarowitz from Yale's program on climate change communication has written to me, the single most powerful thing your profession can do is document and preserve for future generations this critical moment in the history of our local communities, our states, our nation, and the whole world. Joining me in today's discussion, I am so honored to have several colleagues here who are undertaking important work to preserve collections that are already being impacted by the climate crisis, and colleagues who are preserving historic and more contemporary collections that document the impacts of the changing climate, with the aim of making these available for use by scientists, researchers, and the public to further our collective understanding of climate disruption and the various outcomes and scenarios that humanity and the natural world may experience in the future depending on decisions made today and in the immediate years ahead of us. We will begin with a presentation by Dr. Kevin Wood, research scientist at the University of Washington's Cooperative Institute for Climate, Ocean, and Ecosystem Studies and the NOAA Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, followed by remarks from Brenda Flora of the Amistad Research Center at Tulane University, Fletcher Durant from the University of Florida, Jason Clark from Montana State University, and Katie Basile from KYUK in Bethel, Alaska. So thank you to my co-panelists and again to everyone watching today. And Dr. Wood, I will hand it over to you now to ground today's conversation.
Okay, so thanks, Casey. I'm going to be presenting some thoughts as a climatologist and customer of archives. So I'm not an archivist. I want to make clear also that I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I don't represent the university or NOAA in any official way today. So I work with historical records. My focus is on collections of specific kinds of historical data, that being instrumental marine weather observations and descriptive reports of sea ice. Our aim, the people I work with, my colleagues, is collectively to improve the tools we use to understand and predict weather and climate for the benefit of all. Here, I'm going to set the stage for the wider discussion that we're about to have. So now this is a very simple schematic of the present state of the climate. So the blue line that you see here is a temperature scale. And what this is the temperature above the pre-industrial global mean temperature, which is sort of the standard we use for understanding climate change. The green circle is the pre-industrial Earth, or basically the time period that sets the baseline. We're now 0.8 to 1 degree above the baseline, represented by the yellow circle. And we know already that under present emissions, we are going to be moving toward 2 degrees above baseline. The IPCC has set this as the limit of dangerous climate change, which is of major concern already. But I would like to point out that beyond the 2 degree point, there is no guaranteed upper limit of the trajectory of climate change unless we do something about emissions. So what do I mean about dangerous climate change? This is the point where higher temperatures cause large-scale ice loss, sea level rise, disrupted geophysical and ecological systems, risks to humanity and well-being increase rapidly from that point on, and unrestrained emissions could take the climate far beyond this limit, which is represented by the red circle at the end of the scale, uninhabitable hellscape. I'm not saying that that's certainly where we're going to go, but there is research suggesting that we can't say for sure at this point that we're not going to go there unless we take action. So switching over to the science, this slide shows basically the infrastructure that we use to study and understand climate change. Most people are familiar with the idea of the global climate model that we use to project the coming century. But within that infrastructure, there's also Reanalysis, which is a sort of backwards looking high performance forecast model that runs on historical data. And what we learn from Reanalysis then can be used to set the initial conditions that the global models use then to run on just physics far into the future. From those, we get climate assessments. From Reanalysis, we get what's called a 4D reconstruction of the Earth's atmosphere. And from that, we can gain new understanding as we improve Reanalysis from year to year, so that we can better inform and understand what the global climate models are telling us. But below Reanalysis, there's the source data. So that's these historical data sets here. Now, the information flow, naturally enough, considering this is all of our resources globally for historical data, comes from archives. So the material we find in the archives is the basis for what goes into historical data sets and then eventually works its way up through the Reanalysis and to our best case global model technology. But there are critical limitations here, and that sort of brings me into the domain of archives, really. The first is having access to the primary sources at scale. So what I'm talking about here is digital imaging of the logbooks, both in the US and around the world, in small libraries that hold merchant marine logs, for example, whaling logs. All of those are of interest to us, but that is a major sort of limiting factor, is access and the digital imaging step. The next major limitation is in conversion of images into actionable data. What this means is either manual transcription through citizen scientists or some other manual keying, or the development of some automated means. That's an area of active research right now, and it is going to be required if we're going to actually convert all of the available resource into actionable data. And then lastly, a lot of the infrastructure that underpins our historical data and the things that depend on it are legacy. So portions of it date from the 1950s. So all the limitations of those days are with us still. So I want to show you here just very quickly the output of one of these state-of-the-art historical reanalyses. Reanalysis is short for retrospective analysis. What you're looking at here is just a still, and the color key is the blue to red shades represent air temperature. The green is rain. The gray area, I call it the fog of ignorance, because that's where there's not enough historical data currently integrated to give us a reliable result. The black dots here are where we have observations, and the arrows, if you look very closely once I start the animation, are wind. So what I want to illustrate here is what the passage of time and the increase in the number of observations does to dispel the fog of ignorance. So if you look in the upper corner with my mouse, this is 1860, and then we're going to jump forward. We get more and more data integrated into the system, and you'll see the fog of ignorance receding and the number of observations increasing. So here, this is 1942, so World War II era. You can see in the Northern Hemisphere, we've dispelled quite a lot of the fog, And as we go along, you can see more and more of the Earth. Observations are available, and we have a much better idea of what the state of the climate and of the weather moment to moment. What we can do nowadays, since the advent of high performance computing, we can do way more than we used to be able to do even 20 years ago with historical data. So what I'm talking about here specifically for the world ocean are these ship deck logs. These are very unusual assets. They're unique. There's no other document quite like it. They're common to all seafaring nations that have ships. This is a fundamental record kept by every ship. They represent in the global collective 200 or 300 years of instrumental weather observation over the world ocean. They're extremely data rich. As you can see from these two examples, the key variables that we need to build the reanalysis are all here, primarily barometric pressure and the temperatures. You can even see that the format, at least as far as the US Navy logs goes, doesn't even change. You can recognize the pattern of data just by comparing these two examples. Also, it would surprise many people to know that most of the data that was collected has never been used or integrated into a modern data set. Just for the World War II US Navy collection, represented by the picture on the right, only about 1% of the data is available to us in digital form. And finally, I think I've mentioned this before, this is actionable. We can recover this, turn it into digital data, and then run reanalysis with it. So we can get a global, objectively derived picture of the climate for every 3 hours for the past 150 years. So it's also a cautionary tale. What we have in our primary data set, which is called ICOADS, the International Comprehensive Ocean Atmosphere Data Set, derives from IBM punch cards that were punched in the early 1950s. So what that means is there was a massive loss of metadata, lower precision, and very incomplete. But that's what we've been working with over the last period of years. Now with reanalysis, we need something better. And incidentally, all the project metadata and microfilm behind this was lost back in the 60s. So we don't know the ship names, several other details that we are trying to recover. So then this brings me to my thoughts now about archives and the role of archives in climate change. And from my point of view, I can see that there are some primary source assets that relate to climate change that are relatively actionable. They can be converted and fed to our big climate models. They're broadly impactful on a regional to planetary scale, while others are not. They're very difficult to convert into this kind of thing, but they are often culturally priceless. So there's a range of things that different communities rely on archives for. So in a world of limited resources and increasingly vulnerable communities and fragile institutions, do we need to consider prioritizing the digitization or preservation of some assets over others? And I would say start with the most vulnerable communities, and then the most actionable kinds of data if we can do that. But who decides what that prioritization should be? I think it is possible to develop a responsive climate action mitigation guideline for archives with these objectives in mind, but it requires input from the affected communities, scientists, indigenous people, in order to set those priorities appropriately. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brenda Flora. I'm the curator of moving images and recorded sound at the Amistad Research Center. We're currently working on a CLIR Hidden Collections project, digitizing the films of Ed Pincus, who's a documentary filmmaker. So the Amistad Research Center is an independent nonprofit archives and library housed on the campus of Tulane University in New Orleans. Our collections reference the social and cultural importance of America's ethnic and racial history, African diaspora, human relations, and civil rights. The Ed Pincus Film Collection came to us in 2002. Mr. Pincus donated both the completed films and outtake materials related to his Natchez, Mississippi civil rights documentaries, Black Natchez and Panola, as well as the footage he shot for a sequel to Black Natchez that was never completed. Our CLIR Hidden Collections project will finally make these additional hours of raw footage available and viewable. For 10 weeks in 1965, filmmakers Ed Pincus and David Newman shot footage in Natchez, charting the early attempts to organize and register Black voters and the formation of the Black self-defense group, the Deacons for Defense and Justice. During this time, George Metcalf, president of the Natchez branch of the NAACP, was murdered. The footage became the film Black Natchez, and they also used footage from the same session to produce a short documentary, Panola, which followed the life of a single African-American man at the height of the chaos. The filmmakers returned to Natchez in 1967 following the murder of Warless Jackson, the local NAACP treasurer, to record the aftermath of his death and follow up with the subjects of the first film. The film captures the response of the Black community to the activists and to the murderers. It was shot cinema verite style with observational scenes in the street, at barbershops and restaurants, and at organizational meetings and protests. It's a window into the thoughts and feelings of the community about the racial tensions and violence in the city, as well as the political organizing surrounding it. So this project is part of a greater initiative of digitization and description projects that Amistad has taken on in the 15 years since Hurricane Katrina with the help of funders like CLIR. After Katrina and the widespread flooding that followed, Amistad, like many cultural heritage institutions in the Gulf Coast, took a moment to pause and assess the state of the institution and prioritize our work moving forward. What they found was that a great deal of attention had been paid to acquisitions in the early life of the center, but we were lacking in description and accessibility, and many of our collections were hidden collections in the truest sense. And this problem was amplified by a surge in research requests as national attention focused on New Orleans and the Gulf Coast at that time. When I came onto Amistad in 2010, my position as the center's first audiovisual archivist was part of a push to digitize, describe, and bring our finding aids and collections online. We learned the value of increased access points and digital surrogates, but also looking at peer institutions trying to reconstruct their flood damaged collections, the importance of having firm intellectual control over our collections. So we're constantly in the process of adding to our digital holdings. Obviously, digitization isn't the answer to the climate crisis, but it's a very useful tool both for preservation of physically threatened material and as a means to share community content with a wider audience, including individuals who might have been displaced during a disaster. So that's what we're working on.
Thank you for having me here today to talk about the University of Florida and the University of Puerto Rico Rio Piedras Film on a Boat project, which is also a CLIR Digitizing Hidden Collections grant project. This project started in part, at least the University of Florida side, because of our historic ties with the Caribbean, and really beginning in the 1950s when the University of Florida hired a librarian and a boat to sail around various Caribbean islands and nations around the Caribbean basin to digitize, to microfilm newspapers and other documents held at public libraries and government offices in the Caribbean. And so to date, UF holds about 6,367 reels of Caribbean newspapers, which totals almost 6.5 million pages of newspaper content. That to date has been relatively inaccessible as it is held solely on microfilm and has historically been poorly described for the most part. And so, we're certainly coming to a changing time where we want to talk about making our collections, put them in connection with people who may have the greatest use, and whether those are scholars at UF or other academic researchers, but also community groups. These are, primary sourced material that document life across the Caribbean. And so we also have general preservation concerns for these materials based on when they were created. You may be familiar with vinegar syndrome, but we also found, starting with Hurricanes Irma, Maria, Harvey, and Michael, that a lot of our collections are at risk from climate disasters and climate-related disasters. And as we increasingly see large damaging storms barrel through the Caribbean, we want to make sure that historic documents are are preserved up to, in a digital format that is accessible, but also then that we can house it away from our primary storage facilities in case there is a disaster that wipes out an archival collection or a library collection. We also saw, particularly following Maria, that there has been an increase in movement, of diasporic movement and growth from Caribbean nations into the US, among other places. And so we want to make sure that those diasporic communities have the ability to look at their history as they may have when they resided in their homes in the Bahamas or Puerto Rico. And so we're partnering with UPR to digitize over 800,000 pages of historic newspapers. It covers over 70 titles from 23 nations and islands. All the materials that we've selected are out of copyright and in the public domain, so we can make them freely accessible. We work with the Digital Library of the Caribbean to make this material accessible to institutions around the world. And so anybody who wants to can go to dloc.com and look at this material as well as other content from around the Caribbean. What comes next? We're a year and a half or almost 2 years into our digitization project, so we have a lot more digitizing to go in the future. And then really in the future, we're already working on a collections as data project to turn our newspaper text files into a big data set, particularly so that researchers can access information about historic hurricanes and other storms in the Caribbean. And with that, I want to say thank you to all my project team.
Thanks for the opportunity, Casey, to be on this panel. I'm going to speak a little bit about our mountains, from the mountains to the prairies, and trout to the dace, revealing climate population impacts on culture and the economy of Montana's fisheries. I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, the research motivation for parts of this project. So this project is really trying to document how watersheds change, how fish populations change, how insect populations change. And really what we're starting to see is a picture of things, of how, just to get to Kevin's idea of like lifting some of the fog around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. There are parts of that ecosystem which really covers most of the Rocky Mountains all the way, if you really think of it as a range almost up to Alaska and down to New Mexico. Certainly there are parts of that ecosystem that are hyper studied and known, but there are pieces that aren't. And really this motivation, I was seeking and wanted to understand different ways that local stories could be told. Because I think when you talk about climate change or advocacy, you need some kind of narrative that fits into a particular mode of experience. So parts of this started with a conversation with Robert Bramblett, who'd been doing research for much of his career on eastern Montana, which those of you who are or are not familiar, Montana is known for blue rim trout streams. We have an economy around those trout streams that includes guides, tourism. So there's a particular kind of experience and understanding of how you experience the cold water fisheries of the Rocky Mountains. But what Robert I had a coffee with him, and he kind of mentioned that there's more to this story. And what he had been seeing over the course of his career is warm water moving closer and closer to the mountains. So this was that moment for me to realize the local narrative, our local, the way that we could tell an impactful story for a particular community. So this, I do want to note that the project itself is a series of, I'm going to show the collection in a second, or mention the collection in a second, but this is an interdisciplinary group. Robert Bramblett was an applied researcher working in eastern Montana, putting his waders on and going to these small drainages and just sampling and pulling and finding a story through that data. We also involved our ecology department, our special collections, and then we have an entomologist who's also part of the ecology department here. So there's a big kind of a swath of people that are kind of working on this idea. And I think that's another thing to take forward. When you bring these narratives together and you're thinking about how do you want to present a story and provide research for people like Kevin, you need a bigger team. I also want to note two of the central staff. This is our project team, Chloe Rice, who is a PhD student, and Brandon Watson, who is our digitization and metadata expert. So the narratives, the collections themselves, I think this is something, another piece of this is that you've got general trout and salmon collection that MSU had been curating for years. And these are like representations of fish, stories about fish. Isaac Walton's first, The Complete Angler, one of the first Western narratives about angling. All of those coming together with specimens. We work with a lab on campus that actually has these fish and vertebrates in particular forms of representation, whether it's jars or physical specimens. Then we have logbooks and data. So all of that coming together in this moment to provide a particular kind of data set and representation of this climate snapshot. I want to talk a little bit about outreach and implementation, because this is where I think we can kind of think through more closely about how you do this, not only tell a local story, but also do it with a different kind of impact. So we're using existing initiatives. Our data is going to be an open data set. And it includes places like, we're working with the state library as one of our partners, Montana State Library, and it's getting into their field guide, which is K through 12 implementation. So parts of this data are going to be potentially available to K through 12. And then we've got like existing initiatives like FishBase. I didn't know there was a FishBase, but there is a FishBase where researchers go to learn all about this kind of data. We have corners of Montana that are still in low broadband environments. So I think a lot about this when we put data together, when we're trying to give access to high performance computing, we're intentionally thinking about the tools. So these might be the smaller digital libraries that we're thinking about. We're thinking about small prototypes that allow digital library browsing, but also like how do you optimize big data to move and still be useful, but also accessible. We've taken our cues from minimal computing, which is something that was brought to DLF in 2016. Along with this interest in advocacy around a local narrative, we're also thinking about how do you do green digital libraries? How do you build accessible digital libraries? And not only the actual tool that delivers, but the actual data. So all of this is kind of part of our motivation for this project. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Katie Basile. I'm the multimedia director at KYUK Public Broadcasting in Alaska's Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. I'm based in Bethel. Okay, so to just ground you geographically, this is the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, the southwest corner of the state. We are a very we have permafrost, tundra, coastline, and roughly 50 communities that are predominantly Yupik and Chupik. That's Alaska Native communities. Just a quick look at what our area looks like. It's not the mountainous Alaska that you might envision. It's very flat. We're on two river deltas, the Yukon River and the Kuskokwim Delta River. And I work at KYUK. This is, we're one of the first indigenous stations in the country. We started broadcasting in 1971. We are a radio and television station, and we broadcast in both Yukon, which is the Yupik language, and also English every day. And we have an Alaska Native majority board. So I'm white, non-native, but I work at the station and I take directives from our board and from our communities. We have what we believe to be one of the largest Yupik and Chupik audiovisual collection in the world. And a few years ago, we started an initiative called Nudashluki, which means make them new. And this initiative is to take our analog collection and digitize it. So far, since that time, we've actually moved the physical collection out of Bethel and into a vault in Anchorage. So we're working with an archivist at Summit Day Media, and actually one of our former general managers also works with him. It's kind of a perfect situation where he's helping to fill in some of the gaps in our collection as far as who was filmed or audio recorded, where were they, who actually did the filming. So we have kind of a perfect situation where we're able to fill out our catalog and our database. We've received funding from NHPRC for digitizing the first 1,000 video assets. And then we're partnering with CLIR to digitize 2006 audio and video assets from the collection. And this collection will be available publicly on the America Archive for Public Broadcasting. And then we're also handing over everything we digitized to the local school districts, where they're actually developing local place-based curricula in both English and Yukon and also Chupik. And then I wanted to talk a bit about climate change. In our collection, once we receive all the digitized material back later this year, we'll be combing through to look for reflections on weather patterns, lifestyle changes, and the bulk of that information or that content is from 1971 forward. Starting in about 2007, we were documenting some of the climate change impacts in Newtok, which is, I believe, is the first community in the country to actually relocate because of climate change impacts, which specifically here are usually permafrost melt, rapid erosion, and flooding. This is the shoreline in Newtok in July. I was there in July. And you can see actually the little building that's hanging over, I've heard a couple weeks ago, is now gone. It's actually fell into the water. This is Newtok from the air. This shot's from 2018. So already that shoreline is probably another 100 feet inland. This is what the erosion looks like up close. And I'm sharing these slides specifically because we've done quite a bit of documentation in Newtok that will eventually be in the KYK archive as well. And then last year, we released a short film, a 12-minute documentary called To Keep as One, documenting the relocation of Newtok to Mukhtagavik, which is a community that is under construction now, and about a third of the community has relocated to. And so our efforts are ongoing as far as documenting the way climate change is impacting our communities. And we're really grateful to have sort of this wealth of knowledge that's documented on video and audio tapes that informs the way things were before, and through our ongoing documentation, we can kind of see how things are changing over time.
Thank you, Katie. How about we just get started with the first question that I had. What does an ice-free Arctic mean to archives? We've heard from Katie talk about the impacts that they're seeing physically in their own communities, but across the globe, what does an ice-free Arctic mean to archives?
Well, I would say the first point to make there is that indicates that we are moving down the track past 2 degrees into an unknown future. When we start to see that, it's, the presence of ice or the non-presence of ice in the Arctic is sort of a milepost that we've been watching for the last 30 years as an indicator of climate change. And so I think we have plenty of warnings already that this is happening. And so we should be preparing for that now and realizing that it is probably going to happen sometime, perhaps in our lifetime.
What steps do we need to be taking as a community within the next 10 years to prepare for what might be some of the worst impacts of climate change if our leadership globally is unable to meet the goals set by the Paris Agreement?
I would say that individually, every archive should have a disaster plan, even if you aren't in a vulnerable area or what you think is a vulnerable area. And so you have a plan ahead of time of what happens if something goes very wrong for you. And everybody should be investing in digital infrastructure to back up their collections, but also to back up institutional records that could be affected, and make sure you're spreading digital copies around to places, different places geographically, so that you have places that might be safe. But beyond all that, I think we do need to focus on advocacy, because we can't react our way out of it. We have to be active from the start.
So we've worked after Hurricane Irma came through, generally the length of Florida. We worked with the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which is a group formed between FEMA and the Smithsonian Institution to work with heritage institutions following disasters. And so we were able to set up a phone banking operation in which we contacted as many heritage organizations in the state of Florida as we could locate, just to check in with them, to see how they'd fared in Irma, and then to try and provide them some direction for getting in touch with either FEMA or conservators, depending on what their need was to respond to any damage that they might have suffered, whether it was primarily to facilities or to collections. And so in some ways, we're trying to figure out a model for how statewide or regional organizations can help heritage organizations and archives respond to widespread disasters, because all too frequently we think of emergencies on a local level, but when we see massive storms like Irma, like Maria, like Harvey, those local networks are overloaded, and each individual organization sort of has to have their own response. And so we're trying to figure out how there can be a bigger network of institutions that can reach out to make connections during hard times, so that no one single institution has to feel like they're alone during their recovery period.
I also want to highlight the work that like Era Tanzi and Ben Goldman have been doing to plot where archival institutions are located and what impacts they might see over the next decades related to climate disasters. So I would definitely recommend checking out the work that Era and Ben have been doing.
And Casey, that's the Repo Data project,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, you can find that online, and they have wonderful maps showing various climatic risks, mostly from sea level rise and storm surge.
So we talked also about storing digital copies in a geographically separate location, and Fletcher, I know you talked a little bit about stewardship of physical collections created by island communities and diasporic communities. So in preserving the materials and protecting them from climate disaster, how can we ensure that they are, that these collections remain stewarded in a way in respect of the communities that create them?
So part of our agreement with AAPB is that our collection will also be housed at the Library of Congress, and that is having, so basically we'll have copies on the East Coast, we'll have copies in Anchorage at our archive there, and then digital copies back here in Bethel as well. And we have an advisory board that we work with, made up of community members and elders who kind of advise us on what we should and shouldn't be sharing. And so far, the overwhelming majority of what people have said is share everything. We don't have anything that we need to keep to ourselves. And so far, everything will be going up on the AAPB website that we've seen come through so far. But it's really important that our communities have that say. Another way that we've actually put out PSAs on our radio station, just asking people to call us and give us input if they think there's something in the collection that might be sacred or not for the public. And so just that constant connection with community is really important to us. I think along with thinking about how we're preserving these copies, we also are thinking really strategically about how we're getting them out to our communities. You know, every person goes through the school system here, and so making sure that our school districts, that's one way. That's also, the schools here are a digital access point. That's a place where people have access to the internet. So making sure we work closely that way. And then also thinking about having kiosks at different festivals in different communities so that people can access our collection as well. And when we're thinking about climate change, I think one of the values I hear reflected on by elders here a lot is just adaptation and resilience. And so if we can really share that messaging out to our communities, I think that in itself really helps people find courage in the face of climate change and the climate crisis.
Jason, I liked one of the comments that you stated during your presentation. When you talk about climate change or advocacy, you need stories and a narrative that fits into a particular experience. So what kinds of collections do you all feel could help with advocacy and helping shift public perspective on the climate crisis, understanding that it's still a politically charged topic, at least in the United States?
Well, certainly the oral histories and personal testimonials about experience in people's lives are very powerful, probably the most powerful sort of thing that we have in that area. Is it's an eyewitness to the kinds of things that most people in the lower 48 aren't aware of, yet are very visually and in various ways powerful, that that is able to be related to all kinds of people. So I think that's definitely a good thing to do. The next question is, how do you make that available, and how do you preserve that record for the long term?
And in addition to the culturally significant materials that you kind of talked about in your presentation, Kevin, you and Jason are working on collections that can be turned into actionable data for use in scientific research. So do you want to talk a little bit more about the types of collections that are sitting out there still that could be used to support this type of research?
Jason, you want to go ahead?
Sure, so I can. So I'm going to kind of openly wonder with the group about particular forms of legal documents. Kevin showed the manifest. I thought of them as ship manifests files.
Tech logs, yeah.
Right, and I kind of, it just got me thinking of these things that we record because we have to. And in particular, there are a number of advocacy or environmental groups in our region that I think in a particular scope around environmental research, that could be interesting, but legal advocacy groups in just about every setting are probably, when they file a case, when they bring briefs forward, there are probably data points inside of those kind of documents that most of us might have access to or the ability to archive. So that's something that kind of strikes me as potential. I'd have to go look at our particular, we have like a Greater Yellowstone Coalition papers. So something that strikes me is just like, how do legal documents that have forms of reporting that are required in them, how could those be data points in a bigger picture around climate? That's something that strikes me.
There is work being done. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative to collect federal environmental data and reports and websites that were at risk of being lost or removed.
We've just gone through a period where what we thought was reliably available on federal websites disappeared, and that shouldn't happen. And if it requires backing up to the Wayback Machine or whatever it is. I think people are going to be paying much more attention to that now, going into the future, because we've seen it happen.
That makes me think that we might all have material in our collections that we're not thinking of as scientific data necessarily, but like agricultural records about how the land was being used, or maps, even like photos and just film footage that shows how the landscape has changed might be useful.
Absolutely. And one of the things that comes up in my work is that we build these really very high performance reanalysis systems, but that the data we get from that allows you to go back and say, well, what was it like on the Great Plains in 1880? And then you open the door to these stories. In fact, there was a recent publication that someone that did that basically used reanalysis to validate the stories of the Little House on the Prairie. There's one, what was the author's name? Wilder.
Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yeah. And so there's a set of stories that she wrote about the bad winter of 1889 or whatever the year was. And now that we have the reanalysis, you can actually go back and objectively analyze that moment in time. And of course, the story, the research found that the story was basically right, that it was an exceptionally bad winter. But there's all kinds of stories that you can, when you can put those two things together, you can start to tell.
But one question I didn't want to overlook before we finish up today, how does all of this connect to the movements that are happening right now, the environmental movement, the climate movement, and other social justice movements? Any thoughts on that?
I would say that it's usually communities that are already vulnerable in one way or another that are going to be most affected by these disasters, both by direct effects of climate change, but also by the systematic and bureaucratic responses to it. And that just because a community survives a disaster doesn't mean that they'll necessarily survive the recovery process, which tends to favor the people with influence and wealth, So when we're thinking about collecting, we should be thinking about collecting from everybody broadly so that we can represent all of these communities in our collections, but also think about how the information that we have can help serve those communities to protect them and strengthen them before something happens.
I was just going to chime in and say that I would also say that outreach to impacted communities should be a major part of any collections mission, and that it's not just the fact that we can go out and bring information in, bring data in, bring collections in, but we need to be in touch with the communities that can then use the data, and whether it's as stories or as lawsuits. That I think for too long, most collection organizations have been exclusive in who they allow in to use their materials, and that in the future and in the present, we need to be more inclusive, and beyond just saying the phrases of diversity, equity, inclusion. That collecting organizations need to be proactive in their outreach.
I just want to add to that. I think that bringing people from those communities into organizations like ours, and making sure that they have a seat at the table from the get-go, from the beginning of the project, and really able to share their perspective on how things should run, and who should have access and how access is best given. I think that's also really important.
Thank you all so much for participating in today's conversation. One of my heroes, climate scientist Katherine Hayhoe, says that one of the best things you can do to address climate change is to just talk about it. So I think the more we have these conversations within our communities, the more that we'll be prepared and be able to develop resiliency plans and ensure that the voices of those who are most vulnerable and impacted by the climate crisis are preserved. So there's still so much work to do. Really glad that we had the chance to have this conversation today.